Hello, this is Sarah Tsui from Global Green News. We are a new green media outlet based out of Montreal, Canada. I want to welcome today the Green Party of Ireland TD Neasa Hourigan. Ms. Hourigan is the Green Party TD for Dublin Central, as well as the Green Party's Finance and Health Spokesperson and Chair of the Policy Council. So honored to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you were one of the major forces behind the postponement of a vote to ratify CETA in Ireland. The Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement between Canada and European countries was originally to be voted on last December and is now pending to be retabled in the Oireachtas in the new year. What were some of the responses from within the Green Party as of the latest discussion last week? And from what you've heard, is there a date on when CETA will be voted on in the Oireachtas?
Well, let me answer your second question first. I've been told that CETA will come before the Oireachtas again in February, so I'm obviously on high alert. And that's as much as I know. I'm not sure if there's an actual date.
Okay.
I think that the party has obviously had a number of conversations now among the membership. We haven't managed to organise a kind of a binding vote. Our party's policy, let's be clear, is to be fully against investor-state court mechanisms as they pertain to CETA. And to overturn that policy, you would need a vote by 2/3 of the membership. So my position was, as a chief negotiator to the coalition which formed the government, that CETA and particularly the investor state courts, which are not an EU competence or a domestic competence, were not included in the programme for government that we negotiated. And we are also, as a party, against that particular mechanism in CETA. And therefore, I would not be in a position to vote for the Oireachtas motion to ratify investor state courts under CETA. That's where we are right now. I think for many of the membership, CETA and in general global trade deals of this nature are very difficult to understand. They're quite complex in their nature. And then on top of that, the kind of legal ramifications of something like an investor state court mechanism is even more hard to understand. And then on top of that, what I was trying to convey to people before Christmas is not only the kind of the hard reality of investor state court systems, which place, corporate welfare and corporate profit above the welfare of our citizens who we're kind of sworn to protect and represent, but also the climate and nature. But that into the future and for future generations, these kind of court mechanisms have a chilling effect on domestic legislation. So it's not necessarily that they would change domestic legislation, but that they disincentivize national governments from being ambitious when it comes to climate change.
Understood. Now, in mainstream media, you may have been portrayed as one of the major opponents preventing this trade agreement from going through. In your opinion, what is missing from mainstream discourse in Ireland on issues such as CETA and what it means for the environment?
I think Ireland suffers from a similar problem to every single country, is that it's incredibly difficult to communicate to the general public how large macro issues around climate and trade and global finance and tax relate to, the climate change that they see every day. So it's very hard to explain to somebody who's, for example, experiencing flooding or is experiencing, a milder winter than they're used to, or a more severe winter than they're used to. Why, for example, tax mechanisms in the EU. So for somebody in Canada to try to say, well, look, tax mechanisms in the EU is having an impact on our ability to implement climate action. That's a very difficult thing to explain to people. I think, my way of dealing with it is trying to bring it down to very simple things. The idea that big corporations could sue the people of Ireland for their loss of profit if the people of Ireland are trying to protect their climate, their natural habitat, or in fact their health, is wrong. In a very simplistic way, it's wrong. Corporations should not be above domestic law. We should not have a court system that exists outside our domestic law. Corporations should not have access to a different form of legality and legislation than everybody else does. That is wrong. That is placing money and profit above people, and that will not solve the climate crisis.
Agreed. In an interview in October of last year, you were asked to react on the fact that support for Greens in the polls had fallen over 60% among women and working class voters primarily. Are you concerned with the leader of your party, Eamon Ryan, aligning himself with center-right forces on subjects such as free trade and how that would impact the Green Party?
I think that we entered a coalition with two parties who were right of centre, and that coalition agreement got a huge percentage of the membership support. It got 76%. I voted against that coalition. However, I'm very mindful that our members support it and believe that some climate action, some green agenda is better than no green agenda. And I take that position very, very seriously. However, I think that when you enter a government like that and you, well, for me anyway, I'm a left leaning politician. I would position myself on the left of the political spectrum. You're constantly in a position of trying to represent that position in a way that makes sense and that is true to the core principles of the green movement. For me, if climate action is to be enduring, you need to bring people with you. And that means that it's, you know, more than anything, that it's just for working class communities, that it's well communicated, that it makes sense for people's lives. If we don't do that, then it becomes a surface exercise. It's something that will not endure. And that's the nub of it for me. It is very difficult to be in a centre right coalition as a centre left or left politician. And I think, you know, the dissent over CETA and the fact that we managed to get it pushed back off the agenda, that is a prime example of why I've hung on in here. I don't know how much longer people like myself can hang on, but a CETA is a really good demonstration of, you know, trying to put forward that sense of a global community of climate action, and how these particular systems link up to mean to kind of thwart national governments' best intentions. And it does feel right now maybe that message doesn't always get accepted by, you know, people at a higher level, but we have to keep on fighting, and hopefully I can keep fighting that fight.
Agreed. Thank you for that. So last question. 3 of the top 10 investor-state dispute settlements, according to the Transnational Institute, are cases where a Canadian mining company is suing a host government for losses, be that Romania or Ecuador or Colombia. So what people don't see is the years or even decades of pushback from grassroots movements, indigenous groups, people who risk having their drinking water contaminated. Now, if CETA is to go through in Ireland, what can be done still to hold foreign corporations, such as Canadian companies in Ireland? What do you propose can be done to hold them accountable? Can we invoke other international treaties or other regulatory tools to prevent foreign companies from exploiting the system?
I think if we push through CETA, that argument and that fight becomes immeasurably harder. I think if Ireland ratifies the investor state court mechanism of CETA, there are 11 other countries who still haven't actually put it through their parliaments. I think Ireland is one of the few that has to have a parliamentary vote on it, which makes it very important kind of pressure point for CETA. I also think that, you know, Ireland is one of the few countries in the EU who have never in the past signed up to an investor state court, and so we have a kind of a good reason, a good argument for saying that we don't want to do it this time. And I guess the last point on that particular issue is that we know that you can renegotiate these deals. Like if we look at, and you know, we can be as critical as we like over the Trump era, but the repudiation of NAFTA, which really, you know, and the renegotiation of NAFTA didn't amount to a whole lot in the end. It was more of a renaming than anything. But one of the only things that it did achieve was to remove investor state courts out of that agreement. And so it's my position that if we did reject ratification of just this one aspect of CETA, not the entirety of CETA, just investor state courts, I have no problem with trade in general. I think trade can actually be progressive, but investor state courts are not progressive. And I think that we could repudiate that part of it and renegotiate investor state courts out of the agreement. So I'm not ready to say that it's a done deal yet. And I know that that's something that within our domestic political sphere, that is part of the story they're trying to tell. CETA is a done deal. Investor state courts are a done deal. It's not a done deal. Anything in politics that you have to vote on is still a live issue. So first of all, I'm not giving up on CETA, and even if it goes through in Ireland, I think it should be fought at every single country. In all of those 11 countries, there needs to be a fight to stop investor state courts and allow people the time to reconsider that issue. But secondly, I think the basic principle of having a separate court outside of domestic or even supranational law, because obviously there's a lot of, within the EU, there's a huge amount of kind of legal mechanisms that sit above the national court but within the EU framework. I think once you set up a state an investor state court that sits even beyond that, you're into very, very difficult territory. I guess some of the things that we could do is explore how we could make it less of a one-sided system, because at the moment it only allows for investors' claims, and I don't see why that would be. Why can't we, as a nation, use the same system to sue corporations for the damage that they've done to our natural environment? I think that we could look to protect the right to regulate. So we could bring in further legislation within CETA to protect the right to regulate. I think that we could require that every single domestic legal remedy would be exhausted before you would go to that mechanism. And I think that you could bring in things around protecting smaller states, because the liability for a smaller state to be sued by a big corporation is much different. So if you're Ireland, the investor state court mechanism means something completely different than if you're Germany, because you have the means to argue your case against a huge corporation. And then I guess the final thing is, if you were really going to try and so if you had accepted that CETA it was happening, which I don't, the last thing would be to make sure that you get the actual tribunal members and the staffing of that tribunal and who is on it and how that actually works, the mechanism of the court itself, right. I think that it is what's in the CETA agreement right now is not right. It's very questionable who is on that and how they get appointed. So I and what the turnover would be there. So I think there's a whole host of things that we could do after this, this particular fight. But I think the best thing to do is to continue to have energy for the fight we're in right now.
Thank you so much for speaking out on this issue. And I just want to thank you so much again for your time today, Ms. Hourigan. And it has been such a pleasure, and hope to speak to you again in the future.
Sarah, it was so nice of you to invite me, and I really appreciate it. And hopefully we can stay in touch.
Great. Thank you again. All the best.
Okay, you too. Bye bye.